This is the Infrastructure Matters podcast, brought to you by the Futurum Group. We explore the latest developments in hybrid cloud computing and the technology that underpins it. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the latest trends and technologies that are shaping the hybrid cloud computing landscape. The Infrastructure Matters podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Please do not take anything reflected in this show as investment advice. Now your co-hosts, Stephen Dickens, Camberly Bates, and Krista Maycumber of the Futurum Group.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Infrastructure Matters podcast. My name is Krista Maycumber, and I'm joined, as always, with Stephen Dickens and Camberly Bates. Stephen and Camberly, good morning. How are you both today?
Fantastic.
It's a Friday. We're recording.
Exactly.
Always a highlight of the week to record this show with you two.
It's a great way to close out the week for sure. And we do have a great discussion today. So as always, we're going to kind of kick it off by discussing a few news items that occurred this past week. We're recording this session on Friday, July 28th, 2023. And then we have what I think is going to be a really cool discussion regarding the various consumption models for IT infrastructure. We'll touch on what exactly that means, as well as some considerations. So looking forward to digging into that. But first, to kick it off, Stephen, why don't we maybe start with you? I know that you covered a couple of news earnings releases this coming week. So any color you'd like to kind of contribute on that?
Yeah, big week for earnings. The big two names in the hyperscale cloud marketplace of Microsoft and Google both announced earnings. Solid sets of results for both. I just don't know how the market reacts to these. One, the shares went up after trading. The others, the shares went down after trading. Makes zero sense to me. But I think the key points, I think people were focused on Gen AI, and lots of mentions of the words AI in their earnings announcements. Unsurprising. I think there's a buzzword bingo that CEOs and CFOs have to tick the word AI at least 20 times in an earnings call these days. But I mean, all joking aside, really solid numbers from Google. Still too early. I got some chance to be on TV and talk this week and talk about some of those numbers. And I published a Forbes article just this morning that we'll put in the show notes that kind of summarizes my take. But I think the high level message for me is great set of numbers for Google. Could argue they may be taking some share. I think while everybody obsessed over Microsoft kind of numbers slowing, 26% growth is still fantastic numbers by any measure at their scale. So whilst the trajectory might have slowly tailed off, we're talking about a tail off from north of 40% to 26%. So let's all just get real and say a behemoth like Microsoft growing at 26% is still a fantastic set of numbers.
Absolutely. So, Stephen, looking ahead over this coming quarter, what maybe is, one thing that you're kind of keeping an eye out for each company?
Well, I think it's going to be more and more from an AI and how that starts to reflect itself in their numbers. We saw some product announcements out at AWS's New York Summit event that I managed to attend on Wednesday. I mean, I think this is going to be the consistent trend for maybe the next 6 months. Every set of announcements is going to have something in it from an AI point of view. We saw that from Dynatrace this week. We saw it from Splunk last week. I think every enterprise vendor is going to be thinking, how do I infuse more AI into our offerings? I don't see it as a standalone service. I think it's just going to be infused in everything that enterprise vendors are doing.
And that goes into, like, this week we had the briefing with Dell and their latest generative AI items. And while they announced that at Dell Tech World, the Project Felix coming at real, server work with they're doing with NVIDIA. This was another progression of them getting out into the world. So I think what they're going to, hopefully what they'll be doing, I mean, they're going to be on a pace here to kick all these things out. And this added services, this added an edge device to the offerings that they have. That's looking at where we're going with the generative AI space. So and you are absolutely right. It's going to be this constant drum roll for a while. At the same time, though, and I'll say is that we've got so much work to do to get to where we can be really productive delivering and trusting of the generative AI that we're going to deliver. So there's a lot of work to do. This is not a quick, let's go and flash in the pan and we're there.
I think we're in the early innings. This feels like the first. I mean, it's interesting. I saw a post from IBM today on social that they've been doing AI for decades now. We can think back to Jeopardy, and we can think back to them beating chess masters. But I think from a deployment of generative AI and these large language models, we're still really, really early.
Right. Generative AI is a different game. So
yeah, for sure.
The other thing about the earnings this week that was interesting was we were watching and going back and forth with the analyst team talking about it was both the Intel and the Seagate announcements. Mm-hmm. They're both all their earnings. What I loved is here their earnings are down. Their numbers are down. Seagate's number is like 39% down or whatever. Just and you can blast away what those numbers are. But at the same time, the market was up 7%. And it's kind of like, okay, so how does that work? And it's like, and I said something, it's like, well, both these firms have been forecasting to say, this is how bad it's going to look, guys. This is how bad it's going to look. It's kind of like, to me, it's going into tax season thinking you're going to own $1 zillion in addition to what you own. And the accountant comes back and goes, you only own half of that. And you're going to go, yeah. I just won. And there's a little bit of that. There is some of that going on. So with the Intel announcement, the big news there is that the trajectory of some of the slowdown is not going where it was before. It's definitely slowing down and feeling like maybe, especially on the PC side. And I don't track the PC side, so I'm not an expert there. But that's what they were talking about, is that we're hitting the bottom of a trough here and can pick up. On the Seagate side, which is all about hard drives, and who's absorbing most of the hard drives right now is the public cloud. So that goes in line with what you're talking about, the Googles and the Azures and that kind of stuff, and seeing where their numbers are at and settling in. And now they're starting to absorb the technology that they've had maybe sitting on racks or whatever and bringing that to.
So on the Intel earnings, it was interesting. I think for the Intel piece, for me, they've reached the bottom. This isn't stock advice, but the feeling I got away from it, and Daniel commented on this in some of his social media posts. He spoke to Pat Gelsinger this week after earnings. Kind of has a feel of they've reached the bottom of the bad news from an Intel point of view. There's a lot of catch up to do, especially in GPU for those guys, but I think it feels like the end of the bad news from an Intel point of view.
They're not going anywhere from that perspective, right? Yeah, that's definitely interesting, and a little bit of a kind of a correlation into our bigger topic. So not related to earnings, but I did this week have a chance to catch up with N2W Software. They are a data protection provider focusing on AWS and Azure environments. So it's interesting that they're sort of picking their spot, choosing instead of kind of going up against some of our, household names, if you will, in data protection that are long established in more traditional workloads, really trying to carve out that niche. And they had a number of announcements with their updated software. The two that really kind of jumped out to me, one is that they have the ability to replicate data for long-term retention from AWS into Azure, and vice versa as well, from Azure into AWS. So when we think about parlaying our conversation into consumption models, it's really a great option for customers because, they have kind of a new option for long-term retention and maybe a little bit more flexibility when it comes to placing their bets in terms of what is going to be most cost-effective for them over the long term. And then another feature that they added, among others, was the ability in Azure environments to have essentially disaster recovery playbooks that can be executed for testing perspectives to kind of prove that ability to recover, which is becoming very important, especially as we think about being resilient against ransomware and other cyber attacks, and to be able to automate that recovery as well. So, with that, why don't we turn our attention now to kind of starting to talk about what exactly is a consumption model? I can start by kind of maybe giving a few comments, and then Kimberly and Stephen, I'm sure that you'll want to kind of chime in and add your view as well. So this has obviously been going on for quite some time now. You know, we've been talking a lot about the shift to the cloud. I know in our one of our earlier podcasts, we had a conversation regarding possible repatriation from the cloud and some dynamics that are going on there. So really, when we think about a consumption model, from my perspective, it breaks down into a couple of key areas. The first is really centered on kind of the pricing and procurement. So when we think about software, typically that's moving away from a perpetual license that's kind of deployed on premises to subscribing to something on more of a subscription basis. And increasingly, we're seeing that hosted in the public cloud. And from an infrastructure perspective, it's pretty similar as well. It's really looking at, okay, I'm either kind of buying a box and deploying it on-prem, using kind of that upfront capital expense, or maybe I am shifting to using some of these infrastructure as a service offerings that are hosted in the cloud. The only other thing I think I would comment as well is that there is sort of a managed consumption model where maybe the infrastructure is either co-located in a secondary data center, or maybe it is still hosted on the customer's site, but they're working with a managed service provider for day-to-day kind of management and to kind of streamline some of those capabilities. So again, my thoughts on how I'd kick it off, but Kimberly, Stephen, I'd love to hear what you might have to add.
So I look at it as the phasing. You know, we started out, as you were saying, the initial ones were I wanted to buy my compute, my storage by the drink. Okay, so I could potentially have, and this is where, you know, Dell, and I'll rattle off some of the names so people understand who. Dell has got their Apex. Hitachi has got their Everflex. HPE has the GreenLake, who was kind of the people that started some of this on-prem. IBM has got their services that they bring. Kyndryl has their kind of services, which they're well known as outsources. You have TrueScale from Lenovo. NetApp is Keystone, and Pure has their as a service as well as their Evergreen products. And all of them have this wide variety of consumption models because there is not one size fits all with everybody's financial books. And one of the latest ones that we've seen is the end users want to own their the hardware technology, and then the software that's on top of that allows them to do the subscription model, consumption model, if you will. Where we first started out was this managed service piece of it, where they'd roll, you know, much like the outsourcing, no, well, not much like the outsourcing, but they'd roll in a box and say, okay, so you're going to use, let's take storage for it initially. I needed 500 terabytes and I needed at this performance level, this LA, et cetera. And that's what I signed for. And I paid by the drink. I usually signed a couple-year contract or a 3-year contract. And as I needed more, or I true up every month with how much I used so I could burst and come down. And so since that was the original kind of view of it that was totally managed. We've come back to where there's, you know, in some instances, it's less and less of the fully managed, but it's just by the drink kind of thing, or it's this slice and dice between the CapEx and subscription kind of tech area that we have. So it's lots of flavors in there. So we're getting back to that very creative financial selling that I am sure that all the sales reps are doing when they're representing their products to the customer.
I think to echo some of Kimberly's points and go back to your original framing, I think we used to talk about on-premises and public cloud, and it was very much, I buy some infrastructure and I'll CapEx it on-prem, and then my only other option if I don't want to own infrastructure is to go to the public cloud. I think if you look forward now and to echo some of your comments, Camberley, there's a plethora of options. And on-prem doesn't mean what on-prem meant sort of 5 or 6 years ago. You've got the ability to put that in an Equinix or a Digital Realty or another colo provider's data center and get kit you own. And I'll put that in sort of quotation marks for people who are listening to this on audio only. Yes, you kind of have got a relationship with the hardware provider, and you sort of technically, maybe in some way, shape, or form, are either owning or renting it or consuming it by the drink. But it doesn't have to be in your data center. A lot of the early conversations around public cloud were, I don't want to be in the data center business, therefore the answer is public cloud. I think it's a lot more evolved than that now, and you can get out of your data center but still be having a sovereign cloud or a private cloud in a co-location. So I think, and then you go into the other piece that you mentioned. I think there's two components of this for me, and Camberley was talking about it also. There's the hardware and software component of this, but the other thing that customers and enterprises need to be thinking about is the financial model. It's as much about what the flex up and flex down, what the commitments are, whether they're length of time, the sizes of the increments, how much you're paying on a regular basis. Can you truly flex down? I think that's a restriction with a lot of the models. It's a flex up with a baseline, but can you truly flex down? If you go back to your example of, I need 500 terabytes, but maybe next quarter I only need 300. Can I go down from the 500 base? That's always an interesting discussion. So I think there's kind of two components of it for me. There's maybe look at it in three ways. There's the where is the kit, and that's a vector of, is it in my data center? Is it in a colo? Is it managed? There's what is the infrastructure itself, and then there's the financial model that wraps around it.
Yeah, and if you think about it, we saw this definitely on the data side of the house, where when you would typically buy a system, you would look at what your requirements are for usually 3 or 5 years, 5-year depreciation schedule that you wanted that box to last for. You buy a certain amount up front. You always want to have some headroom. You're not going to run, if you're crazy, you run up to 80%. If you're less crazy, you're running at 60% capacity, so you have that bump kind of thing. So this gives you, in these scenarios, what you're doing is you're buying just what I'm needing. I'm going to the grocery store, I buy dinner tonight. I'm not buying for the entire week or the entire year or whatever. So this allows you to do that. Now, financially, you got to run the numbers to see if this makes sense for you, depending upon, how predictive your numbers are. Because, of course, once I buy a system, I can usually always add shelves to it or something like that. So I'm not necessarily buying everything up front. And so those numbers have all got to be run from my financial tools. And I know one of the things that we've been doing with some of our IT end user clients is running those models for them, helping them understand where the trade-offs are on there and sort of things. So one of the other considerations here is, if you're going to look at managed type services, and these are usually called outcome services. It's like, what are the outcomes and the commitments that you're getting from the particular vendor that's providing it? For instance, what's my SLA? So we all know the SLA up in the cloud is 3 nines. But if you're doing an outcome-based managed service, whatever that outcome-based managed service is, you don't, it's got to be more than 3 nines on premise. So you're looking at a 5 nines kind of consideration. And that's what most of the folks are doing, is when they're bringing those kind of things, as well as what is the management services that are behind it, who is doing that work, et cetera, how responsive are they, et cetera.
I think that's an interesting point to sort of make here. As enterprise architects look at, do I put this in the public cloud? Do I put it on-prem in my own data center? Do I buy the kit? Do I rent the kit? Do I go with a consumption model? Do I put it in a colo? I think some of the rubric for that you talked about, SLAs and availability. I think performance is another rubric. We talked about some of this with workload placement. I think you can apply that same rubric and decision-making process that we talked about in workload placement, whether it's performance, availability, scalability, security, economic factors, or environmental factors. There might be a case for putting a database workload on infrastructure that you own in an Equinix data center, cross-connected across the data center to a AWS point of presence, because you want an AWS front end, but you want the database on and the data and the security. And I was going to ask you this question as well, Krista. Maybe you need performance, maybe you need availability on the data layer, and maybe you need some enhanced security on that data layer. So I think it's more evolved than I'm either doing all of it here or all of it there. Are you seeing that from a data perspective, Krista, as well, and some of the security conversations you're in?
Absolutely, 100%, Stephen. You really hit the nail on the head. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because that was going to be a kind of the other component that I was going to bring up, was both security and compliance. I think as long as the public cloud has been around, security and compliance have been two potential barriers to adopting the public cloud. Of course, as usage has evolved, we've run into a number of these other factors that we're talking about. Again, things like overall cost economics, for example, that have, as we touched on in our other episode, in some cases encouraged actually workloads to be brought back on premises. But certainly we're seeing that customers are having more kind of fine grade options in terms of using some of these multi-hybrid cloud approaches to not only meet some of those areas that you're mentioning, like performance and availability, which certainly from a data security and kind of a data protection standpoint matter, right? You need to be able to meet your backup windows. You need to be able to have, appropriate recovery times depending on what application or piece of infrastructure it is that's being protected, right? Those things certainly make a difference in terms of the decision making. But also it is the security and compliance end of things. We have customers, depending on their industry, where they say, I cannot utilize the public cloud for either a backup repository for kind of a long-term retention, storage implementation, or even for kind of an air gap or data isolation type environment, simply due to the regulations of my industry, or due to the concerns from the business that this infrastructure is not going to be secure. So certainly we're seeing that can play a significant role in the decision-making there.
Yeah, I agree completely. The challenge with these enterprise architects is all of these platforms are valid. You just got to and all of these options are valid and often make a lot of sense. The decision making about which one you use is the crucial piece, and when you use it and for what workload. We're back to workload placement, but it's exactly the same for these consumption models.
Well, one of the other things that we were looking at, we do create a matrix of considerations or features, functions, of capabilities, and when we evaluate some areas. And one of the other things that was on there is like, what's the consideration for at the end of life, right? So when you lease a car, that end of life kind of situation is important about what your mileage may vary. So how does that work in terms of when you want to flow into the others? Because very often, especially when we come from the data side, the IT guys would take, I'd buy, the best and the brightest for my top applications. And as I came to end of life, that older gear would then move into another life, if you will, that's handling some older, data that I didn't really care as much about. I don't have to have a high availability, reliability, speed, or whatever kind of things. So that changes kind of what's on the footprint, what you have over the long haul, and how I manage my technology tiering, if you will. And I think that happens the same, and I'm not quite as familiar. Steve, you probably know it. Does that happen the same way with the servers as well? They kind of
that end of life sort of what goes on with the server. It was interesting. I was out in Lenovo's factory in Hungary, and they're taking a lot of kit back in, sort of
Okay.
refurbing it and second life for servers, maybe in emerging markets, maybe for different workloads. And obviously there's an eco component of that. If we make these things and they only have a 3-year life and then we're taking them to landfill, that's not good for anybody when that server could have maybe another 4 or 5-year life doing something else. Maybe that's emerging markets, maybe that's less critical workload. So I think, I hadn't put that in the equation, but I think it's definitely something to think about, especially as ESG concerns come in.
And it's growing. We have conversations with clients that say, on the vendor side, that say, this needs to be a part of the conversation with customers, because they want to know what will the overall economic impact be. And I think it's the only other thing that I might add here too is the ability for the customer to access the data, especially as we move into kind of managed services or hosted services. One thing that we encourage, IT operations to look at when they're looking at these contracts is their ability to access their data once the contract has terminated, because sometimes there are some stipulations around that. So really understanding, what access will there be to the data after that contract is concluded is important.
Exactly.
So it kind of thinks about it is like, okay, so it's no longer just a technology decision. It is a financial decision that you're going to have to plug in the numbers and figuring out how you want to get involved with your controller to figure out, what's my budget look like? Although that's the other piece of this, and that why some people are looking at it is because it's, I don't, let's say as an IT guy, and I'm running out of capacity someplace, I'm running out of, I need more. I don't necessarily have to go back to the well and ask for the CapEx. Mm-hmm. I have a consumption that ticks up, and wow, that is a whole lot less pressure on me as the guy that's trying to manage that. And that's why one of the reasons why this is really super attractive is because I just don't have to go through that process every time.
And the flip side of that is FinOps, because that can run away with itself very quickly.
and I, as a person that's run a business, I keep saying death by 1,000 cuts. So it's like every time somebody runs their credit card for $100 or $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever it is, it's kind of like, you know what? Pennies do matter. We'll go back to Rockefeller.
What right? The pennies and the pounds look after themselves.
Exactly.
Oh, that's a good
so
point.
I think that could be its own can of worms for its whole separate podcast. So with that, I know we're kind of getting close to time here. I think that might be a great place to wrap up our conversation for today. We do want to thank everybody for watching, for listening, whatever your kind of preferred platform choices. Please make sure to like and subscribe, to this channel, to this video. That way you can make sure to receive updates on a weekly basis when our new episodes come out. And of course, for Futurum Group as a team, we're very active on all the major social media platforms. So we, again, appreciate you joining today, and we look forward to having more conversations with you on those platforms. And I want to thank Kimberly and Stephen, as always, for a great conversation.
Great.
We'll see you next time. Thank you.